Hello there, friends. Welcome back to another episode of Generation Tech. My name is Alan. We just finished Tales of the Empire, and I have to say, aside from really enjoying it, I'm starting to get a better sense of what Disney's strategy here is for Star Wars going forward. Ever since Disney launched their streaming platform in 2019, there's been a noticeable shift in how this company creates content. Now, prior to the streaming wars, Disney was okay with releasing their shows on other networks, channels. On the Marvel side, you had Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. for ABC, The Punisher and Daredevil on Netflix, and for Star Wars, we had the Clone Wars TV show for Cartoon Network. Now, during this time period, Disney was okay with selling its content to other channels for money. This way, they eliminated some risk by not having to distribute the content themselves. They did have their own Disney channel, I should mention. But yeah, this was kind of the time period. The networks were kind of balancing each other out. The entire industry was pretty stable. But then came COVID, and suddenly everyone was trapped at home, with their eyes glued to their screens consuming content. I remember at the time getting record amounts of YouTube views. Our ads did go down somewhat, but yeah, record views is always awesome. And I was under no illusion that this was something I did myself. I knew my content hadn't gotten better. I didn't get funnier or anything like that. What had happened was everyone was fucking trapped at home because of this pandemic. And I had no illusion that this would be permanent, that this would be the future. I knew that one day we would all return to home and, if we didn't, well, then running a small YouTube business doesn't really matter that much, does it? And this is a small business, It's me. I do all of the writing. I have my editor, Congo, who does most of the editing. And then what you see right here is a digital avatar. Because I'm extremely shy, I don't want to be on camera. But COVID had a very different effect on large media companies like Disney, who weren't small and able to basically be unaffected by what was going on in the world. For one, you had an extreme slowdown in movie production as safety became an issue on sets. Also, because no one else was going to movie theaters, it also created a problem for studios. See, in the old days, movie studios would make money in two waves. First, you have the initial theater run, and then you have the DVD and home video sales, which were oftentimes huge. But now, because of the digitalization of content, there's really no need to own a physical copy, so movie studios are missing out on all of that revenue. And on top of that, the entire movie theater industry was on fire. I mean, either movie theaters were closing, or people didn't want to go, or the local government was allowing people to go. The whole situation made it very clear that no big movie studio was going to launch a blockbuster in the next year or so. And so many movie studios were just hibernating or in stasis or just panicking as their money was basically running out. These movie studios also watched Netflix and YouTube enviously as they grew during the pandemic at record rates. And so it's not surprising that all of these movie studios would end up going into streaming, even if they had no idea what they were doing. And soon every publicly traded media company was being pressured by Wall Street to also venture into their own streaming platforms. And that's exactly what started happening. We started seeing streaming platforms, both small and big, popping out of nowhere. You also had companies like Paramount, who probably didn't have the resources to actually do this, but went anyway because of market pressure. I mean, this is really the groupthink hive mind of Wall Street, who at their core are a bunch of chimps who lack basic understanding of most industries and only understand short-term profit. Rarely are they ever early on trends or innovation because that actually requires independent thinking. What these guys are good at is creating bubbles, putting a lot of hype and glowing up products, industries that perhaps already are past their peak. Because again, mainstream Wall Street is not interested in investing in companies. They aren't interested in the health of these companies, what their impacts on society are, whether they're going to have sustainable business models. They're just all about speculation and short-term profiteering. And so I, along with you, watched as these movie studios all pumped in millions, if not billions of dollars into creating content. And they didn't do this because, they cared about the customers. They knew we were all waiting at home, with nothing to do. They did this because they were trying to kill each other. This was a streaming war. Now, Disney actually had a legitimate reason to be in the streaming war. They had a massive catalog of movies and films. The purchase of 21st Century Fox's backlog also helped quite a lot. But Disney faced a problem that almost every movie studio faced when transitioning to streaming, and that's the fact that everyone's already seen their backlog, and no one is willing to pay a monthly fee for old movies, right? And so from 2019 on, we had a lot of content for Star Wars. I mean, if you look at the animated series alone, we had The Resistance, 7th Year of the Clone Wars, The Bad Batch, Tales of the Jedi, Visions. And then we also had live action shows like The Mandalorian, Book of Boba Fett, Kenobi, Ahsoka, Andor. I mean, do you guys remember what it was like being a Star Wars fan back in the day, being starved for content almost all of the time, unless it was like a novel or a comic? And so I was genuinely happy when Disney took over Star Wars, which was notoriously mismanaged and had its IP thrown all over the place, especially in the chaotic and very vibrant expanded universe. More importantly, it seemed at the time that Lucasfilm either lacked the energy or resources or manpower, or all three, when it came to making more Star Wars content or having a larger vision of what it should look like. But of course, that initial happiness with films like Force Awakens gave way to disappointment with The Last Jedi. The Mandalorian spun off lesser stories like Book of Boba Fett. Even Kenobi, which featured the always talented Ewan McGregor, kind of felt like a cash grab somewhat. There are still glimpses of excellence, of course. Andor is not just a TV show, it might be the best made Star Wars content we've seen yet, but these shows are rare. What wasn't as rare was the animated content. The announcement that the Clone Wars 7th season would be launched would lead to The Bad Batch. There was also the show known as Visions, which was basically a collection of short Star Wars stories made by different animators. Now, I enjoyed Visions. The short, compartmentalized format of these videos meant that they were hyper-focused and, without too much fluff. But that was also a problem. Like, the Visions show was not really connected to the larger lore that much, or at least to specific storylines. But then finally came the Tales of the Jedi, the predecessor of Tales of the Empire. This series took the short form of Visions and told neat and very concise stories, but set in the wider Clone Wars galaxy. The first season of the series would showcase Count Dooku in the years leading up to his fall, and we would also see different moments in Ahsoka Tano's life. And man, the jump in quality in the writing, the music, the cinematography, the jiggle physics, it was immediately noticeable. Every episode is heavy and dramatic, the dialogue is slow and intentional. In many ways, Tales of the Jedi reminded me of some of the best episodes in Star Wars animation. It's almost like Dave Filoni is trying to show us just how talented he can be when lifted from the restraints of larger shows like The Clone Wars, which he developed a quarter of a century ago with George Lucas. The Clone Wars was a feast at a buffet. It was a massive, epic show with diverse types of content, even different genre stories ranging from political thrillers to war dramas. Buffets are great, but when you spend long enough of a time eating at one, you'll start to notice that there are good items on the menu, okay items, and then filler designed to keep you full. It's the goddamn rice, guys. I don't care if your character's cultural background gives you buffs from eating rice. Rice and fries, that's filler content at buffets. It's a trap. You gotta focus on seafood, ribs, protein, and then repeat. What, you guys don't have like generational trauma from famines in your family's history? Anyway, the Tales series, both the Jedi and the Sith, are not like eating at a buffet. Instead, it's like eating at a celebrity chef restaurant that you've been to many times, and now you're sampling his greatest hit menu. And when you bite in, you can taste so much love in the food that you realize this is probably what he should have been doing all along. And if you ask Dave Filoni, he'll probably agree somewhat too. You see, Filoni started writing shorts for different Jedi characters very early on in the process of making the Clone Wars series. This is basically research for creatives. The more you write a character, the more you understand them, and the easier it is to tell their story in an authentic way. When I write a character, I always like to put them in the Waffle House at 3 a.m. in the morning, because that's when you really test your true mettle in life. One day, Dave got an idea to turn these short stories into a pitch for Lucasfilm. Remember, when Disney took over Star Wars all those years back, one of the first things they did was cancel the Clone Wars' last season because the Clone Wars was contracted to be released on the Cartoon Network, a direct rival. Disney wanted a show for their own channel, the Disney Channel, and that's where Dave Filoni makes the show Rebels. But Rebels is purposely different. For instance, its art was based on a lot of the early works of Ralph McQuarrie, a very important concept artist who designed a lot of the original images in the original Star Wars film. In Rebels, the themes were also much more focused on family, and then even the story was surrounding a much smaller group. And while I liked Rebels, it's always been clear to me that Dave always wanted to get back to the Clone Wars, his magnus opus. Anyway, the last season of the Clone Wars TV series would air even without Tales of the Jedi. And Dave Filoni was right. There's still a bunch of crazy millennials waiting to dive back into the Clone Wars with the 501st, Sky Guy, and Snips. And the success of Tales of the Jedi just proves there's an audience for this type of content, which is why Tales of the Sith was greenlit soon after. Filoni talks about the different approach he took when making the Tales of the Jedi and Sith. He called his work here a series of tone poems. The dialogue is more abstract and heavily weighted with emotion. There's a lot more visual storytelling, and while the stories themselves are shorter, the pacing is quite slow. There's even a mention of Miyazaki, which of course put a huge smile on my face. Studio Ghibli is probably my favorite animation studio out there. And they're probably the greatest animation studio ever created. And no, I'm not being biased. A lot of people say this. They're kind of like the Disney of Japan, but like 100 times better. And that has a lot to do with the creative freedom animation gets in Japan. Animation is not seen as a childish format and is respected as a serious medium. And so it's very common to see very adult themes and serious tones mixed in with colorful landscapes and strange characters. There's like a respect here for the duality of what it means to be an adult. We might appear like adults on the surface, but internally we're all still children. We surround ourselves with the trappings of, different professions, culturally acceptable behavior, but the older we get, the less true we are to ourselves, generally speaking. And so animation in Japan really captures that mixture, I think, very well. And when you watch a Miyazaki film, you can tell the people who made these films really love what they do. I mean, there's so much passion and heart here. It's just simply overwhelming sometimes. I mean, many of his movies have reawoken the inner child and inner Japanese peasant inside of me that I didn't know I had, because I'm Chinese. His artwork is also fantastic. If you ever watch one of these films, look at the background, look at the corners. There's almost a Spielberg level of background detail here, all of which is painstakingly created to make depth, depth, and depth. Depth, depth. I mean, I blame Japanese society. Only the Japanese can put enough sweat and toil into a cantaloupe to justify it costing $30,000. Thankfully, they also put that kind of effort into their arts. And so I was very pleased when I saw the first episode of Tales of the Jedi Life and Death, which was clearly inspired by Miyazaki. If you're going to base your animation on anything, that is the golden standard. That first episode brings us to Ahsoka's village, which almost seemed lifted from a Studio Ghibli picture. But high-level cinematography, great storytelling, thoughtful dialogue, and pacing, these aren't necessarily things that Star Wars is known for. I mean, Star Wars is more pulpy. It's more camp in a lot of ways. It's awesome in its own way, but it's not considered like highbrow art film kind of stuff, right? I mean, take a look at Andor. This was an amazing movie. This is one of the TV series that I recommend to all my non-Star Wars fans because it's just so well made. You don't really need to be a Star Wars fan to enjoy it. And if you're a fan of this channel, you probably really like Andor too, because that's all we could talk about when it came out. I mean, how awesome was it that for once it felt like Disney was not just taking advantage of the fact that it owned Star Wars. They weren't taking advantage of the IP. Instead, they made the IP better by bringing in someone like Tony Gilroy. That was something I really appreciated. But there's also a sizable part of the fandom that really did not like Andor for a variety of different reasons. But the realities behind most of their complaints is a lack of connection between Andor and the central story of the franchise, which I understand. Plus, not enough lightsabers and Force-related content, which I'm a little bit more, hesitant to support. Because aren't we just tired of all the Jedi war crimes, all the child soldiers, the misuse of the flag of truce in the middle of a battle? Making a franchise like Star Wars has immense challenges because there really are very few fandoms as old and devoted as the Star Wars fandom. Like, I'm pretty sure 300 years from now, people are going to remember the 20th century by two events. 1954, when the Scientology religion started, and 1977, when the Star Wars religion started. All praise to God Gonk, hallowed be thy name. And because of the current shift towards streaming, every major company is now trying to rewrite the rules, or at least find a format that works in this very chaotic environment. Clearly burning billions of dollars of cash, churning out a bunch of live-action TV shows that, let's be honest, were rushed and were not the highest quality, is not a good idea, and will lead to financial ruin. But despite missteps, Disney survived because first, parents really liked this platform for their kids, and also their original subscription price was really cheap. I think it was $5 or $6 maybe, just a portion of what Netflix charges. And so they managed to get a huge subscription base, which is really important in the streaming wars. Now, I believe that the streaming industry will naturally correct itself in a few years, and that's because consumers don't want to have 10 different apps from 10 different companies, nor can they afford it. Eventually, we should see the same type of bundling that we saw during the cable era, and then, movie studios and content creators can get back to kind of a more normal pace of doing things. I think going forward, Disney will have to rely on more shorts, not necessarily like Visions, which is much more experimental, but more like Tales of the Jedi and Sith. Smaller stories that flesh out the backgrounds of characters that probably need more content. It's brilliant, it builds interest for the main animated shows and live action stuff, and it's high quality, low quantity, which is always preferred in my opinion. And most importantly, animation like this is dirt cheap. Many of the characters and environmental models are done and just need to be tweaked, like the Grand Inquisitor, whose head is now perfectly proportioned, in my opinion. The talent is already hired for voice acting as well. I mean, this is very different from the early days of the Clone Wars, where every episode cost $1 million because of limitations in computing power back then for animation. A lot of things have changed in the last quarter century when it comes to film technology. A lot of that change was driven and pioneered by George Lucas himself. This is also one of the reasons why I'm no longer in video production. It's totally not because I lack talent, ambition, and skill, or all three. Totally not. Instead, it's because I was tired of my skills being replaced by new technology. Now, I think Tales has the potential to solve one of the biggest problems Disney faces, and that is the complete rejection of the sequel trilogy by a huge portion of the fan base. You guys know how I feel about the sequel trilogy. The story itself was rushed, discombobulated. There was no communication between the various directors who made the individual episodes, and this pissed me and a lot of fans off. But the reality is there are a lot of good characters within the sequel trilogy. Guys like Finn, Poe, Rey, Kylo Ren, Captain Phasma, General Hux. I want to see more of them, and I think Tales is the perfect place to showcase their backgrounds and their stories. This is how you reintroduce the sequels to the fandom so that we might actually be able to watch more sequel content in the future and not just be repulsed by it. Anyway, the stories of Bear Sophie and Morgan Elsbeth are a perfect second season for Filoni Adventure 2. I'll be covering both of these characters and their journey in Tales of the Sith very shortly. I figured I'll let you guys dive into Tales of the Sith and finish all 6 episodes before I dive into the actual content. We'll probably be making separate videos for both Bear Sophie and Morgan Elsbeth, 2 very extremely interesting characters. I really love the scene where Bear Sophie becomes a barista in the Coruscant Underground. Did not know I needed that in my life. Anyway, guys, I hope you enjoyed today's episode. I'll see you next time.